Listeners, we are back with just another episode of Digging Deeper. We're excited to have you guys. And I've made a personal choice. I'm sipping on a Coke today, not coffee in a mug with my face on it. Because I realized, what's good in the afternoon on a hot, sunny summer day? And the answer was not hot coffee. So I don't know why I kept doing that. But I switched to a nice, refreshing Coke. Real quick, guys. Coke or Pepsi? Coke. Neither.
Yeah.
LaCroix.
Yeah. Bubbly.
Cherry Coke.
All right. Okay, there it is. Coke people and LaCroix. So, all right. Well, listeners, you probably recognize these faces by now. We have Tawny to my left. Tawny, how you doing?
Good.
Doing good. To my far right, we have Tyler Goins. Tyler, how are you?
I'm doing all right.
And to my closest right, Rod, how are we today?
Happy.
Happy. He just had to outdo all of you guys. No, well, we have a lot of good stuff on the queue for today. Listeners, if you are unfamiliar, we are going through Philippians 2. We taught on verses 5 through 11 this weekend. It was a really great passage. One of those where, well, Tyler, you kind of did the double dip again, right? You were at Redwood and downtown. How was that?
It was okay. Hit a few too many red lights on the way back, but
Ooh, did we get close?
I think I stressed worship leader Michael Bond out a little bit.
Okay.
He was singing 10,000 Reasons, and he's like, do I have to sing this 10,000 times?
So, listeners, if you're unfamiliar, sometimes due to scheduling, we will have somebody from our Redwood campus kind of teach downtown in the morning on Sunday, and then they will go out to our Redwood campus, which is approximately 12 minutes away, if you can.
Yeah, just depending on the lights.
And then we work the schedule, and they come back and hit the latter service downtown. So, haven't had any of those like really, really bad moments yet, but every time we do this, I think we just need to invest in a church helicopter. It would just make things a lot easier. But until then, we will trust in the Lord with the green lights. Tyler, we did get an email from a faithful listener who I'm very thankful for that has emailed a few times.
Is that your mom?
Nope.
Mama Sorensen.
She just texts me now.
Charles.
She just but they did bring up a point, and so I kind of want to give you an opportunity to reconcile or speak to that. So they'd mentioned that you had said that Jesus suffered more than most. The listener said
more than any.
More
human.
than I'm sorry. More than any. Sorry, Jesus suffered more than any, and the listener said. Kind of wanted to maybe push back on that. Say there's plenty of people that have suffered on the cross, plenty of people that have been tortured.
Sure.
But then they kind of offered, what about this idea of Jesus sacrificed more than any? So yeah, I'm kind of curious to hear what your response is to that.
No, it's a good question and a good pushback. If we think physically suffered, that may be accurate. That I'm sure there's people that have been tortured in horrible ways and they maybe physically suffered more. But we know that suffering is not just physical. I think of emotional, mental, spiritual. I mean, we've probably all been through things in life, and we're like, man, I'd rather suffer physically than what I'm going through right here, this relational rift or whatever. And just when we start to add up all the ways that Jesus suffered in those other, I think, other than just physical suffering, we could say with, I think, good confidence that nobody suffered. And Jesus suffered more in 3 hours, I think, than many people anyone suffered in their entire lives, and because he takes it all on himself. And so I think it was accurate what I said, but I also like that idea of Jesus sacrificed more than anyone else too, because he emptied himself, like we're going to talk about, bankrupted heaven to come to us. So so I don't know if that answers the question. I don't know if you guys had anything to add to that.
Well, I was just thinking probably the suffering and taking on the sin of the world is something we couldn't even understand.
Oh, yeah.
So that's, we can barely handle our own sin and shame, but he took it on for everybody that's ever lived or will live. So that had to be a lot of suffering.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just saying that maybe there's also an element of the further you fall, the more it hurts, right? And, if you're a president or a king, and you end up going through this abject humiliation and suffering, maybe that's more painful. I don't know. But he was the King of Kings, and so he fell further in a sense than anyone has.
That's an interesting analogy, or like it makes me think of an analogy like maybe if your air conditioning is working really well and then it stops working, it's like that much worse.
Yeah.
You know, it's like that kind of a lame example, but it is true. Like the further you fall, the more painful it is. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this maybe is a bad analogy, but a CEO falls or gets fired, we hear about it. But if the coffee maker or the intern gets fired, that's not making any news headlines. So the height of the fall, I think, as you'd kind of mentioned. So, all right, well, that was a good word. And again, what I like, this is an ongoing dialogue between us and you guys, the listeners. So. If that didn't kind of satisfy the concern, we'll run it back next week. And we'll get smarter people on the episode. No, I'm just kidding. But before we I guess, we are getting into the discussion now. But what's fascinating about this passage, and this is honestly one of those passages where, as I taught this weekend, I was really, I say this every weekend, but like, Tim, don't mess this passage up. Like, this is such a beautiful passage. And in your studies, you'll find out, and I think in most of our messages we shared, it's a hymn or a poem, kind of. It's in that format. So, Rod, I want to ask you for some context. Why in this letter is this hymn all of a sudden getting inserted into it, and what's the significance of that?
Cool. Thanks for serving that up. I am just totally hawkish on context. Context. You should always say, why is this here? What's this mean in relation to everything else that's gone on before and what will go on ahead? And so I think you need to go back to the book of Acts, where Paul first visited Philippi. And so maybe 10 years before he wrote this letter to the Philippians, he was on his second missionary journey with Silas and Timothy, and at some point Luke joined him as well, so there was at least 4 of them. And Paul had a dream, and he was going to go one direction. They said, nope. God said, you got to go into Macedon. There's a man of Macedon in the dream. And so he wakes up and he's like, we're heading over to Macedonia. And so they head over to Macedonia, and part of that is Philippi. And so they get there and they start preaching, and there's a little church forming. But it's mostly just a prayer meeting with some ladies. And every day they're passing this woman who's demonically possessed, and she's yelling, these are servants of the Most High God, and they are showing you the way to salvation, which was true, but it was not great coming from this demonically possessed person. And eventually Paul got fed up with it, told her, and told the demon, get out of her. And at that point she could stop. She was unable to keep predicting the future, which meant she couldn't make money for her handlers. And so they stirred up the crowd against Paul and Silas, got them thrown into prison. And so Paul and Silas have been beaten. They've been stripped naked. They have been put in the center cell, or the middle cell where there's no light, and their feet are in stocks. Can you imagine? You're bleeding. You're in the dark. Your feet are in stocks. You're naked and humiliated. And these guys, they start singing. They start singing hymns to God. And maybe it was a sense that they knew that they were in the center of God's will. God had sent them there. It was weird. It was awkward. But here we are, and God's in control. And they started singing, and there was this joy. And the prison bars flew open. The chains fell off. Hearts were changed. People came to the Lord. And there was this Holy Spirit power that was unleashed by them choosing joy. And that was then Paul's, 10 years later, he remembers this lesson. And he's in prison again, and now the Philippians are being persecuted as well. And so he's saying, rejoice in the Lord always. I'm telling you again, rejoice. You guys need to rejoice because of the Holy Spirit power involved in that. So that's the context. And they get there, and Paul's saying, rejoice, be joyful, choose joy. Oh, but there's this problem of lack of unity, right? You guys aren't getting along. You're being selfish. You're being into yourselves. You're being mean-spirited. So then he comes to, well, you got to be like Christ. Think of Christ. The blockage to choosing joy was their selfishness. And so he's now giving this hymn example of Christ emptying himself, of being humble. He could have been the main guy, but he chose to humble himself. And so this is the path back to joy by unblocking this disunity, disharmony that they have. So that's, I think, is the context of what's going on here.
Sounds good to me. I'm sold for sure. Thank you, Rod. You guys have anything to speak to that?
It's interesting in like modern day storytelling, like often the high point of the climax, the culmination of the story today is like at the end, or near the end, almost near the end, right? And then you have some resolution. It seems like a lot of times in the Bible, your high point will be in the middle of the book. So we think of Philippians 2. This hymn is like the high point where Paul is going with the book. And then it bookends around it to kind of support what's in the middle. We see that in Lamentations 3, Romans 8. There's a number, maybe Psalm 119.
Good point.
And so it's just interesting how Paul sets this up where he's writing it. And this is almost like he's structured the entire letter around this hymn.
Well, that makes sense because everything should be centered around Jesus always anyway.
Totally.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, yeah, as this is the high point, there's a lot of good stuff in this passage. So real quickly from all of you guys, we could start ladies first. I want your favorite thing about this passage. Maybe it was already said, maybe not. What do you got?
Well, if you start at the beginning of the passage where they just say, have the same attitude that Christ Jesus has, that little phrase has been life-changing for me because at some point in my walk, I realized, wow, I do not even come close at all. And I started intentionally praying that God would help me have the same attitude as Jesus. And it really, I'm nowhere close to complete in that work whatsoever, but it has radically transformed my attitude about hardships, about suffering, about relational struggles that I can't resolve. And so that's my favorite part of this. And just how it goes right into Jesus and how amazing and wonderful he is.
What about the couch?
The couch.
The couch. Here we are.
Tim, Tawny, and the couch.
I think, Jesus not demanding his due. If Jesus didn't feel the need or was choosing not to demand what was rightfully his, who am I to choose or demand what is rightfully mine, you know? And that sets the tone, doesn't it?
Definitely.
Amen to all that. I love how this is like a very short, theological, poetic, maybe punchy kind of encapsulation of the life of Jesus. There's like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, massively big books. And then there's just like a couple lines, and it just so perfectly encapsulates what happens from like a God perspective.
Yeah, which we're going to get into in a minute for sure. I think I'm with you, this idea of having this mindset in you, and as you kind of unpack, I think we talked about at Rogue River, this idea of, I heard this quote, have it in you, this mindset in you so it can be manifested among you. And this isn't like a suggestion for the church. This is like, this is what will make the church. The church is having this mindset in you. Like, if you're not doing this, then you're not the church. Like, you must have this mindset in you. Like, it's vital, or else whatever you are is not the church representing Jesus. So, a lot of good stuff. Yeah, having just one can't be easy, but this whole thing is good. And so we're going to, Tyler, I'm pointing this one to you. One of the first really cool things that kind of jumps out at us is this idea of Jesus and God, Jesus being God. So the incarnation of Jesus is probably one of those big words that we've heard a lot at church. And so, yeah, I just kind of want to send that one to you, unpack it. This idea was Jesus God, was equal to God? Why is that a hard concept for us to get our minds around? So I'm going to start with that and this idea of like, I tried to ask this question earlier to you, so I'm going to unpack it a little bit. Why didn't God come as God, but instead send Jesus? Because that question in itself is even kind of weird because he did. So yeah, maybe unpack the incarnation of Jesus a little bit. And for those of us that are really struggling to commit, not me, but if there's anybody that's really struggling to commit to this idea that is Jesus God, maybe just kind of help us with that.
Sure. Wow.
Unless Rod, you kind of like.
No, I was just going to say, what do you mean by the incarnation?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, thank you. I totally spaced. Jesus being 100% man, 100% God. Not half God, half man. All God, all man.
Wow, well done.
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously a really important idea in Christian theology that Jesus is, like you said, 100% God and 100% man, and he assumes that he takes on humanity in his when he comes as a baby. In the Old Testament, we see Jesus, like God, showing up in different ways, but never quite in flesh and blood, like we are, you know. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of questions in there. You want to like kind of jog my memory on the first one here?
Yeah. So I guess very simple. Kind of start us off. Was Jesus God?
Oh yeah, you know, the whole New Testament and this passage in particular seems to say, you know, Jesus was in the form of God. He you know, Hebrews says he's the exact representation of his nature. And so, yeah, in Christian theology, we believe one God exists in three persons. There's not multiple gods. There's one God, but he exists as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and always has, which is hard to get our mind around sometimes, but I found it more helpful to think of it in terms of relationship, that God is a relational God and always has been. And that's how we can say God is love, because he's always had someone to love within himself. So, yeah, that's where I'd start, I think.
Yeah. So I think the other questions I kind of threw at you were all the same question, just worded differently. So I want to jump to this next one, unless you guys have something to say to that specific part. But maybe this is one that we could swirl around more. What does it look like if someone doesn't believe in the divinity of Jesus? Where they, like, what does it look like in our Christian life if someone's going to say, I don't believe that Jesus is equal to God? Like, is it even possible to continue a Christian walk if you are not sold on this idea that Jesus is equal to God? Maybe that's something we can camp out on a little bit more.
I'll just say real quick, it seems like most of the most deviations from historic Christian belief, it's on this area of who is Jesus and how do we receive Christ, how do we get saved, and so the who is Jesus is vitally important to have rightly that he is God. And so, you know, we see early Arianism believe that Jesus was not God, and it almost took over the whole church, that viewpoint that he was kind of an exalted dude. And modern day Jehovah's Witness belief as well is that Jesus is not fully, that he's not God. He's the mediator between God and man, but not God himself. But yeah, as Christians, we think that's vitally important, and that's what the New Testament shows us.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. How much proper theology do you need in order to be saved, right?
Yeah.
That's a good way to
Are
put
there
it. Yeah.
propositional truths that you must affirm in order to be saved? And as Tyler said, Walter Martin, who wrote Kingdom of the Cults, he was kind of a cult guru in terms of being able to talk about cults, said that's the stumbling block, right? Jesus and how we perceive who Jesus is. But yeah, can a person, say, be trusting in Jesus for their salvation but not believe he's God? It's pretty difficult. I honestly don't know, but I do know that once you get away from calling Jesus God, you start going down some really weird paths. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's where I keep coming back to is Jesus. What did he say? He claimed in 17 different ways that he was, in fact, God. And then he affirmed it or proved it by raising from the dead. So if you are rejecting that, then basically you're rejecting the whole New Testament. And so then you're kind of making things up as you go along, because that's not biblical faith or biblical Christianity. So I think it's really tough to have the Spirit of Jesus in you, which is the Holy Spirit, mm-hmm. and not think that Jesus wasn't God, or not think that Jesus was God.
Yeah, you're making a ton of good points. I saw you raise the mic. I don't know if you're going to add to that.
Yeah, well, I can speak into this a little bit because I was raised that way. The church I grew up in did not believe in the Trinity, and they don't have a really solid doctrine, so you hear different things in different places. But I was taught that Jesus was a perfect man, that God created the way he created the angels to show us how to live. And as a little kid, I'm like, well, that's a stupid plan because God didn't make us perfect. So how are we supposed to do that? And the other thing was, if you don't believe that Jesus is God, he has a completely different authority in your life.
Yeah.
When I realized that Jesus is God, and I love the beginning of John now because it says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word is Jesus. So it's when I realized, oh, he created me, he can tell me what to do. I'm okay with my creator telling me what to do. I'm not
That's
okay.
Great point.
Yeah, I'm not okay with a perfect man telling me what to do.
Yeah, because you aren't thinking that they can relate to you at all. A perfect man can't relate.
Well, like to me, like the creator of something can write the instruction manual, but you know, not another created being doesn't have the authority to do it. So
yeah, no, and Rod, I liked what you said. It's like, okay, so to the question, can you be a Christian? That's a tough one to answer, but it's kind of like it's a gateway to a lot of other things that we can't answer, and they are not good. And I think you completely, kneecap or debilitate just the power of Jesus in your life. Like you said, it's a very small amount of what you're willing to believe if you're not going to believe that part. And like you said, it seems if you believe Scripture, makes it pretty clear, right? He doesn't leave this one to be foggy for us. Mm-hmm. I think it's just one of those concepts that's hard for us to understand.
Well, and the other thing is if he is God, he chose all this. Like God the Father didn't make Jesus do all this. He chose to do it. And so that makes it different too.
Yeah, which then is an interesting concept to chew on when you look at his plea in Gethsemane where he's like, Father, take this cup from me. It's like, because then you're processing all of that, which that might be another episode. But
well, if I can, this really segues into dealing with Jesus' death on the cross.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Because this is a stumbling stone for the Gnostics and the Docetists and a lot of people. The Muslims are like, Jesus, great guy, prophet. No way he could die on a cross. That would be so undignified, especially for God, right? And so people came up with all these other thoughts. Docetism literally means seems like, and it seemed like Jesus died on the cross, but he didn't. There was a phantom there, or one of the crazy views of Islam is that the guy who gave away the location of Jesus, and I don't think in their tradition it was Judas, but that guy got substituted and he went up on the cross instead of Jesus.
A filter on everything, basically, like
right, because Jesus couldn't, even if in Islam he was a prophet, but he couldn't have died in that humiliating fashion. Or for others to think that God could have died, it does blow all our concepts, all our preconceptions.
So, yeah, real quick, this idea of the death on the cross, it's, I guess for us, because we are raised in thinking, wow, what a noble Savior down the cross, you're saying humiliating. So maybe a little bit more context, like why is the cross kind of the lowest of the lows or the forms of death? Because in my mind, I think like, I don't know, getting somebody naked, tar and feathering them, sending them out and stoning them, that would be really humiliating. But
sure.
Why was the cross kind of the worst of the worst?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, they were tortured before they went up on the cross. They were stripped naked. Every crucifix you ever seen has a nice little polite loincloth
Keep
up there.
Keep it PG-13 for the kids.
But that isn't the way it went down. And then kind of what we were talking about before is the height through which Jesus has fallen is another aspect. Another aspect, by the first century, the Romans were basically killing anyone they didn't like by crucifixion, but it was normally reserved for capital crimes like treason or murder or some other violent crime. And so you were a thug if you were up on a cross, So there was a lot of, cultural denigration by being on the cross. It wasn't like, oh, he's a good guy, they just got on the wrong side of the law. No, people thought you were a loser if you were up there.
Okay. You guys have anything to add to that?
Hey, it's just the most shameful thing that there is in that culture.
So when they say a criminal's death, they're basically just saying everything you just said. That's what a criminal's death means. It's not like an extra. There wasn't a little extra to it. It was just the idea of unpacking all of what this is that you just talked about.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, slave's death.
Wow. And then I was going to ask you about if it was a common death sentence, but you just spoke to that and that.
Although Roman citizens could not be crucified, maybe if they did something really bad, but that was reserved for those that weren't Roman citizens. So Paul, for example, was not crucified; he was beheaded. Whereas Peter, we're told, was crucified because he's not a Roman citizen.
Interesting. All right, little cross 101 there for the listeners. that was very good. I really appreciate that. And again, more context. I'm a big fan of context because it just helps, I think, even more bring to life, I think, the word and stuff, because we hear these things. And so, yeah, it's good. Now, I kind of want to switch gears a little bit to maybe some like life application. And then we're going to get this from you, Tani, just maybe what this looks like in our life. So I think of serving others, right? And we all have people in our life who serve others so well. But I don't know how often this idea of serving with everything we have, true servanthood as we see in Jesus' life, like that's next level. And I think sometimes for me even, I'm like, I get in this mindset of autopilot where I'm serving most or some or more than Tani, right? Like we compare. So
Doubt it.
That's never the thing. I never do that. But so my question is, what would it mean to truly serve others with everything we have without this idea of like being self-seeking? Just kind of paint that picture of what that would really look like in our life. And are there examples that you can think of?
Well, for me, this question, I actually feel like I got to take it back to loving, because if all of our serving should be coming out of love. So if we're not serving out of our love for other people, it's like pointless. So really, I think if we're praying and asking God to fill us with his love and asking him what it means to love, serving will come naturally out of that. So the hard part is actually loving people with all that we have, I think.
Okay. Do you guys have anything to that? The idea of serving with all we have, and so Tani's saying kind of goes back to love. There was a second part of the question I want to ask, but I wanted to get any.
Well, I guess one of the thoughts that has been resonating with me is the cycle, and I think Tyler talked about this a bit in the sermon, but that you humble yourself, and in God's timing, he exalts you. And it reminded me of this passage from Luke chapter 14, verse 8. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So, that's Jesus' story. And then he lived it. And then Paul's telling us, do it like Jesus, right? So we humble ourselves, meaning we don't demand our rights. We don't demand the place of honor. And a lot of times that works out for us. Maybe sometimes it doesn't, not anyway in this life, but that's what we're called to humble ourselves, not demand our way, our due, our rights, and God will bless that one way or the other.
Tim Keller has an excellent little book called The Freedom of Forgetfulness. And the line worth the price of the book in it, and we've been saying it a lot, is humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less.
Yeah, that's big.
And Keller calls that the freedom of self-forgetfulness. There's actually a freedom and a joy in this. Yeah. Rod was talking about joy of yeah, and so it's like, oh, I got to be a better servant. I got to go serve with all that I have like Jesus did. It's like, that's actually not the posture. It's I'm not really thinking about me, and there's actually a joy and freedom in that.
Yeah, which kind of goes back to what you were saying, and what's going to lead into our second question. It's where this serving is actually just a byproduct, I think,
Yeah.
of loving God and loving others. And so my question to you is why, when it comes to giving our all, why do we as humans struggle so much in giving our all to God? Answer it in 20 seconds or less.
Because
No.
it's completely unnatural.
We're giving that to you, Tawny.
Yeah.
Take that one.
Well, I think we're born selfish and self-centered.
Can you fix all of us too? That's all.
No, I can't even fix myself. I think we're because of the fall, we're just wired to look out for ourselves and to, if you spend any time around a 2-year-old, that's all I need to say. Anyway, but I think the more we trust the Lord to provide our needs and to protect us and to look out for us, and the more we're living to please Him and not other people and not even ourselves, I think we can let go of a lot of all that stuff and just trust Him to provide. And then there's not as much fear in it. It doesn't feel as risky to give ourselves to His kingdom or give ourselves to Him or to His people, because we're trusting Him to meet all of our needs so we don't have to do it.
That's good. You guys have any thoughts on?
Yeah, pride, fear, all these things, that the impulse for self-protection or self-love in a selfish sense. Yeah,
well, even when I think of this idea of like God coming to earth as a human and then, dying, but then His reward is up in heaven, I think we as humans see that, and there's just this natural desire, and it's just so hard that we can't even, sometimes we don't even identify it, and we can't even like shake it. It's just like, all right, so I'm seeing we have to put forth some effort, some struggle, and there's this reward. So my question is, how do I get more of that earlier, and how do I do less
shortcuts,
of this?
cheat codes?
Yeah, exactly. Like we live life like just constant cheat codes, and it's just, that's our flesh. That's our sinful desire, because we're like, I clearly see what you're calling us to do, Jesus, but I actually think I can do it better. I can do it quicker and with less pain.
Well, I do think delayed gratification is one of the marks of maturity in a believer, or any person for that matter. For a Christian, you have delayed gratification combined with faith as well, because you're saying, my gratification may not even be in this life. I may have to wait for the life to come.
Yeah, I was just thinking about I love adventures, and my husband loves routine, and I was fussing.
Sounds like my marriage.
I was fussing at the Lord about, I don't have anything to look forward to. Sorry, Jason. Anyway, and then all of a sudden I thought, I'm going to heaven, and it was so funny, like, because it was so real. Like, even if nothing else exciting happens in my life, I'm going to heaven, and it felt so real. And I think that's part of it too, is a lot of times it doesn't feel real to us, so it doesn't motivate us in the same way as those glimpses and moments when it really does feel real.
All right. Does your husband listen to Digging Deeper?
No.
Yeah, I don't think he does.
I'm pretty safe. Well, this will be the time that he does.
Yeah, I'm gonna go
So
ahead.
I also told on him for not watching it, and
I'll text
he's the
no.
best husband ever, though. Seriously.
She saves it. She saves it with that line. All right. Well, I got kind of one more bonus question, but I wanted to, as we wrap up this Philippians passage, was there any final stuff that you guys wanted to get to or talk about? Nothing. I'm getting nothing from the couch. Nothing from Tawny. Just bashing her husband. No, just kidding. Yeah, the couch. It works. The couch for sure. All right. So this is kind of random. It's a bonus question that I told these guys that if I had time at the end of the podcast, and maybe I started thinking about it from our, getting that email from our listener. I don't know where, but I got to John 14:12. Says this, I tell you the truth, anyone who believes in me will do the same works I have done, even greater works, because I am going to be with the Father. So the question that popped in my mind, that maybe the listeners are thinking as well, what does it mean after just bragging and talking about Jesus, suffering, sacrificing, giving more than any, what does it mean to be able to do greater things than Jesus?
There's a couple ways that I've thought about it. One is that, so Jesus creates a community of people who are like him, And, you know, I don't know how accurate this is, but by some estimates, there's 2.2 billion Christians in the world right now. And imagine all the individual acts of love and service that happen today. That's greater works in terms of extent,
literally.
in terms of the scope. Jesus could not be everywhere at once, but his spirit can be in his people all over the world. So, yeah, in terms of scope, in terms of, like, Jesus ushers in something, but we get to finish it.
Okay.
And so those are a couple ways that I've thought about greater things, what that looks like.
Okay.
Well, and I was thinking that what's great in God's eyes may be different than what's great in our eyes. Like maybe, you know, somebody bringing somebody a glass of water or visiting them in prison, maybe those are the things that are great to God, whereas we think more of the miracles and, you know, signs and wonders and whatnot.
Yeah.
Also, because he said John the Baptist was the greatest man that ever lived, right? And all he did was hang out in the desert and eat weird bugs and talk, whereas you'd think it would be Elijah or Moses or, you know. So I think what God thinks is great is different than what we think of as great, too.
Well, then what does he say after that? That the least, the worst Christian in the world, whoever that is, I don't know, maybe it's me.
Are they in this room?
Yeah.
But the worst Christian in the world is greater than John the Baptist. And I think it's because he or she has the Spirit. Yeah.
That's a good point.
Wow. Rod, anything to add to that?
I got nothing more to add to those two, so good job.
All right. But you know what you do have? You have books on the table, which means we're going into our resources time. We're going to keep digging. So basically resources again on Philippians or this idea of the incarnation of Jesus. So Rod, let's start. You got the books.
All right, I got the books. I don't know if they're great books or not. Well, one of them is. This one, Choose Joy by Kay Warren, Pastor Rick Warren's wife from Saddleback Church in Southern California. One day, my plan was I don't know, to write a book called The Choice of Stubborn Joy. So pretty close to Choose Joy. I think it's the theme of Philippians is to choose joy. This book is a little more suited for like a small group or Bible study, and it's not necessarily Philippian centric. It's more focused on grabbing verses about joy throughout the scriptures in the New Testament. This one is an amazing tome, The Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright. And if you have ever had a doubt about the fundamental fact of our faith, which is the resurrection of Jesus, this is the book for you. It's heavy.
Like
not only
read,
literally heavy, mentally, emotionally heavy, but it is a great book. And N.T. Wright is one of the great evangelical theologians of our time. And it's thorough and exhaustive. So this is a great book. And, you know, talk about the resurrection, because the resurrection is, in fact, the affirmation and proof that Jesus was who he said he was, the Son of God.
Okay.
N.T. Wright has a podcast, too. They might have some on that, and they're only like 30 minutes long.
There you go.
30 minutes.
That book in
Cliff's
30 minutes.
Notes,
yeah. And if it whets your appetite, you could get the book.
There you go.
My books, one of my favorite books about Jesus was The Jesus That I Never Knew by Philip Yancey, and it's an old book, but
It's good.
That book, I read it probably 3 or 4 times when I was a new Christian, and it helped me so much. Coming from the context of not even understanding what the Trinity was, it was really good. And then I actually really like Beautiful Outlaw by John Eldridge as well. That book just like made me fall in love with Jesus even more. So those are my 2 books.
All right.
Mine it's called God So Loved He Gave. It's by Kelly Kapic, and I think that's the title.
It's a dyslexic person who wrote that?
No, I think it's called God So Loved the World. God So Loved that He Gave, entering into the divine movement of generosity, or something along those lines. You'll type it in and find it. Just a great
Or
book.
you'll find John 3:16, but just go to the second search.
Book, yeah. No, yeah, just the idea of Jesus not grasping, but is giving. And almost like the first sin, what did we do? We grasped.
Oh.
And God overcomes our stealing, not by taking or demanding, but by actually giving. And so it's almost like a reversal of the themes of Genesis 3. And so it's kind of a cool way to look at that God wins us back by generosity. Wow. And so it's a great book, yeah.
Awesome. Well, guys, it was a great time with you guys. Great time with the couch, you gentlemen.
Couch.
I'm excited. Next week, I believe we're going to have Frank and Nat on board. And from what I understand, we're going to talk about something that they don't quite agree on. When it comes to
controversy.
But I would have you listen to their teaching this weekend first, and then we'll come back to the Dig Deeper podcast, figure out what that is. So always a pleasure. We'll have you guys on soon.
Thanks, Tim.
See you later.
Thanks, Tim.
Listeners, catch you next week.